Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to the Zach Peters Podcast. I am Zach. Thank you so much for watching and for listening. And I do hope that this podcast, this message, this prayer, sermon, whatever you want to call it, I truly pray and hope that it actually helps you wherever you are in your life, wherever you are in your journey with God. So without further ado, let's jump into what we're talking about this week and actually the next couple of weeks, and that's prayer. We're talking about prayer from Matthew chapter 6, the Lord's Prayer, and the verses surrounding the Lord's Prayer. This week, we're talking about verse 5 and verse 6. So, if you are a Christian, if you've been around church or in church a little bit, if you have some even small level of intelligence, you've heard the word prayer, and you sort of know what that word means without really thinking about it too much. You most likely know that prayer is important to the Christian walk, and a lot of religions have prayer. So hopefully you understand prayer. Now, for Christians, prayer has very, very, very special significance and importance for your growth and how you go about life. Now, for the students that I pastored for 6 years or so, a lot of times when we talked about prayer, they, like everyone else, had a general understanding of what prayer sort of meant. But to be honest with you, they had lots of questions as well, questions that I never really had considered until I had to actually answer them. And as I have gotten older and gotten more experience, I've run into a lot of adults who ended up having the same questions that my students had. So I know that some of my students and some people have struggled with prayer because they don't think that they can pray well. They don't have the skill in making a prayer sound good to the ears. And that can make you a little insecure, especially whenever you think and believe you're talking to the guy who made the heavens and the earth. A lot of that insecurity also happens when you hear people pray and they do a really great job and you think that sounds fantastic. I can't do that, so I'm not going to do it. Maybe you struggle with prayer because you don't feel like you have enough time for whatever reason that might be. And so you get discouraged because you can't give the amount of time you believe God deserves to prayer. And so you don't do it at all. Like a lot of things in our life, we are sort of 100% or nothing. So instead of offering God the little bit that we can do, we don't do anything at all. Maybe you think prayer is sort of a waste of time because you believe that God knows everything. So why would I spend time asking him for things or talking to him at all if he already knows everything? These are just a handful of the issues with prayer that I've encountered with teenagers, but also with people who have been in church their entire life. Thankfully, Jesus gives us some guidance in the Lord's Prayer that's going to help us over the next couple of weeks to figure out why prayer matters, why I should pray, and how I should pray. So I'm going to read Matthew chapter 6, verse 5 and verse 6, and we'll start there. And these are sort of the verses before prayer. Basically, in these verses, Jesus is saying, this is how you don't pray. You don't pray this way. You don't pray this way. And then he lets us have an example of how to pray. So we're going to start with how not to praise. And then by the third week, we will have how to pray. So verse 5, Matthew chapter 6, it says this: when you pray, it's incredibly important to notice here. When you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, without getting too deep here and too crazy, I want to ask a question that I asked myself and realized that I didn't have a nice definition right offhand. But what is communication? Again, you heard the word, you know what it means, but you really don't know what it means. Communication is sort of a process of connecting with other living things through very specific means and tools. Now, that's not a Webster's definition, but what we have is nonverbal communication is involved here, like body language, smiling, shrugging your shoulders, lifting your eyebrows, facial expressions. So there's nonverbal communication is involved in this process. There's verbal communication that can be as simple as grunts, right? I'm a man and I love grunting to express lots of different emotions and lots of different feelings and to answer lots of questions. What do you want for dinner? Mm. Uh, mm. Like what? It's nonverbal communication. But verbal language is not just, noises. It's organized noises in what we call language. And language has both verbal language and written language. So verbal ways of communicating and written ways of communicating. And we use all of these communication tools to express ideas, to express feelings, to share thoughts, to share and give instructions, stories, history, and anything else you can think of. Communication is wrapped up. It's incredibly crazy important to who we are and what we do and everything we are as humans. It's everything. It's how we get things done. It's how we share ideas. It's how we pass on knowledge. It's at the center of how we organize the world around us and our families and our communities. And here's what I want us to think about today. Communication is at the very center of how we have relationships. Every relationship we have is largely defined by communication and the language we use in that communication. Think about how we communicate with our friends. There is an intentionality in talking to your friends. You have to put some effort in order for that relationship to develop through communication. Think about how you communicate as a parent. Think about how you communicate as a child to your children. There are different things that go into those processes, and what goes into those processes that create a healthy relationship, right? There's a right way to communicate and a wrong way to communicate. And the first thing that has to happen in any relationship in order to have a good relationship is that you actually have to talk in order for there to be a relationship, especially a good one. Without communication, without consistent communication, that the most foundational relationships that we have will, at worst, completely fall apart and be dysfunctional. At best, they won't grow. And that's why I'm not surprised when Jesus says at the very beginning of verse 5, when you pray, not if you pray. Jesus is working from an assumption that you are going to pray. You are going to communicate with God because that's how you're supposed to live. And prayer is simply communication with God. Without prayer, without talking to God, the most important relationship of your life will fall apart, not grow, and not be what it could be. Now, prayer, as we use the word here, it's just talking to God. I've heard a lot of people say, I really don't know how to pray. And to which I now reply with, well, do you know how to talk to a friend or to a parent? For me, that simplifies this process. It's a lot less daunting when prayer can be as simple as our equivalent of a quick text message or a quick phone call. It doesn't have to be complex and crazy. It can be a quick little blurb, and that is prayer. That is talking to God. Of course, prayer can be more than that, but it's still as simple as that. It's both. It can be nice, long conversations sometimes, but it also can just be a quick text message, basically, to God. So, one of the things I want you to remember, I have this in bold in my notes, but you have to talk to God. That process can be called prayer, and Jesus thankfully gives us instructions on what to do and what not to do with prayer. And this week, I want to discuss one of the things we don't do when we talk to God. Next week, we will look at some other stuff, but this week, what not to do. So it says, and when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and the street corners that they may be seen by others. Prayer, again, this is in bold, so if you want to make a note of this, prayer is not for you to look good. Here's what would happen in Jewish society in the time of Jesus, and it's sort of how it still is sometimes and how it was for years and years before Jesus even was born. There were set times of prayer throughout the day. Sometimes during those set times of prayer, you were in the street buying supplies, doing business, doing life, and the time of prayer would happen, and you would stop what you were doing, and then you would offer your prayer to God, and then you would move on. It was just a part of life. It was what you were supposed to do. Now, some people learned to offer very loud and boisterous and complex prayers at the very busiest spots of their towns and cities for attention. They figured out they might get a few pats on the back and attaboys for their prayers. So they missed the point of prayer. They missed the point of a relationship with God. They missed it. They took something that was good, something that was necessary, and they turned it into a tool for their own attention, their own glory. Let me make sure I'm clear here, because I'm not saying praying in public or with other people out loud is bad. No, those things are fine. You just have to be careful that your prayer is not diluted by any desire except to talk to God and to sort of instigate communication with Him. I hope that makes sense. Jesus was not calling them hypocrites because the prayer was outdoors, but because of their hearts and their reasons for the prayer outdoors on street corners. Maybe to someone who is not used to church, maybe they don't necessarily think of this as a big deal. Maybe you do. Maybe you understand. But I can remember a few people in my life where they would stand up and pray and make it a really big deal. And I don't know their hearts, but it almost seemed like they were enjoying hearing their own voice more than the fact that they were praying to God who loved them. Now, again, I don't know their hearts, but we do have judgment and discernment, and there were definitely some spectacles of prayer I've experienced in my lifetime, and that's where the danger is. Again, that's not always the case. Sometimes people get passionate and excited about prayer, and that's okay too. But at some point, for some people, the purpose of prayer gets lost for those individuals. It's almost like wanting to be seen talking to someone famous or influential, not because you like talking to that person, but because being seen talking to that person elevates you in some way in other people's eyes. Prayer is direct communication with God. And it's better that you guard that communication against the danger of turning it into something that it was never intended to be. So you've got to guard the opportunity of communicating with God and making sure that you are keeping perspective correctly. And I think that's why Jesus tells us in the scripture to pray in secret. The communication between God and us cannot be hijacked by our own desire for positive attention from other people whenever we are primarily getting that communication in secret places. Before you pray in public, go talk to God in private. I'm not big on prosperity gospel stuff, but Jesus does say whenever we prioritize talking to God in secret, He will reward us for this private communication. My wife and I talk about things I will never talk about with anything else. She is my closest relationship, and it's in the secret moments no one else could have access to that we communicate the most deeply. Jesus is inviting us to have that sort of relationship with God, with the added bonus that whenever we are communicating and praying to God in secret, He gives us a reward. What that reward is, I don't know. This is a different reward than the public appreciation that the person who's praying out loud for the wrong reasons gets. They might get a pat on the back, but whenever you pray in secret, you get a reward from God that no one else can give you. Take your feel-good moment all you want being appreciated by other people, and give me an answered prayer that no one else knows I even prayed about. That's praying in secret. That's the reward, I think. I think that's sort of what we're talking about here. A pat on the back is nice, but it's not an answered prayer. I want the answered prayer. If the heart's in the wrong place, communication will not produce a healthy relationship, right? And that's ultimately what prayer is. It's a relationship connection with God, and He wants it to be healthy. He wants it to be focused on the right things. I think it's really cool that Jesus expresses this knowledge that God, the creator of everything, is listening to us. He hears us. We don't have to get fancy when we talk to Him, hoping that it somehow inspires Him to hear us better. He's already listening, so just talk to him. He wants to hear from you. And this actually will lead us into next week's material that we cover in verse 7. So we'll talk about that next week. So before we get to verse 7 and the rest, let's finish with some thoughts from verse 5 and verse 6. Just a couple of bullet points, and then we're finished. Prayer is communication with God, and just like communication with people, it can define the type of relationship we have with God. Is your relationship shrinking, stagnant, or growing? Is it healthy or unhealthy? That is largely defined by how much we communicate and how we communicate. Healthy prayer and communication comes from the right motivation. Praying in public is not bad. Make sure you understand that. But praying for attention will not produce a good relationship with God. A good prayer life needs to be based in moments of secrecy and intimacy. Secrecy and intimacy. Again, praying out loud is fine, but I think a lot of your communication and the most important prayers of your life should happen with no one else around. What do we want prayers to produce? Meaning, do we want prayers to produce good relationship, or do we want them to produce attention? Do we want answered prayers or pats on the back? Do we want to draw closer or really waste our breath for other people's applause? How not to pray helps us understand how to pray. And so that's what verse 5 and 6 gives us this week. Next week, we'll talk about verse 7 very briefly, and then we'll have a longer content the week after that, talking about how we actually do pray and talking about the actual Lord's Prayer. So I hope that's helpful for you. I hope that you keep that in mind as you pray. It's not complex. It doesn't have to be complex. Keep it simple. Keep it private for the most part, but don't be afraid to pray in public. Just guard your heart and do it for the right reason. I love you guys. Thank you so much for watching, for listening. I greatly appreciate it. See you next time.